Mr. Secretary, before I ask you a question, let me just say I join in the expression of sympathy for those who were lost on the airplane in Cuba with Senator Udall. But for the record, that plane was a Boeing 737 leased to Cuba's flagship carrier, Cubana, by a Mexican company, which clearly could have kept it updated. And so I think we have to recognize that reality. And one other comment before I return to some questions I'd like to ask you, Mr. Secretary. I've listened to my Republican colleagues question you, Mr. Secretary, on North Korea, and I've heard your responses. And it seems to me that there's an effort here to create alternative facts in which North Korea walked away. But it's rather clear to me that this was President Trump's decision. He walked away, and from my perspective, my only observation is likely because he maybe finally came to the conclusion that of the challenges that dawned on him of the full nature of the negotiations with the North, and that his approach was setting us up for failure. And I think, again, as I expressed earlier, this is a direct failure of the administration to have a credible and pragmatic policy and strategy and lay out the foundations before you ever got to that point. And I'm afraid that that failure and the President's impulsive decisions have lost this leverage. I hope we can regain it as well as reassure allies. I'd like to go to the AUMF because part of the reason we asked you for 2 rounds was to be able to deal with that. So let me ask you, Mr. Secretary, knowing as a premise that the administration fully believes it has all of the authorities it needs and therefore doesn't need an AUMF. But also having heard, as my good friend Senator Kaine has said various times, that Secretary Mattis and others have said that it would be good to have the United States Congress in full support of the actions being taken across the globe by having Congress weigh in. So, recognizing that you feel you have all the authorities, but if Congress is going to vote on an AUMF, does the State Department support the Corker-Kaine AUMF?
We still are seeking some additional changes to it. I will give you Mike's view, which is it's better than what we've seen before, but we're still hopeful that some of the terms, there's a lowered threshold for the quadrennial review, there are issues surrounding associated forces and a couple of others that we'd still like to work on language. Maybe it's just technical, but certainly things that we would like to work on you before we say that we support it.
Okay. So let me ask you this. Specifically, under the text as it is, it theoretically is possible that Congress could pass a resolution disapproving the use of force against a new associated force after kinetic action by the administration has begun. Would the administration comply with such a congressional resolution of disapproval if this was the law?
I don't know the answer, Senator. I don't know the answer. I mean, if it's the law, well, we always comply with the law, if that's your point. But you're asking me to interpret a piece of legislation, to give a legal interpretation of a piece of legislation.
No, I'm not asking you to give a legal interpretation, so it's very clear.
But if you're asking if we'll comply with the law, sign me up.
Okay. Well, all right, good. Because I'm afraid
try to do that every day.
We're going to. I appreciate that, but we also have the ability to have interpretations or to invoke other powers, to suggest that that action is going to take place. So I worry about that. It's the same type of question that I would ask you about the administration complying. It's possible under this text that the Congress could pass a resolution disapproving the use of force in a new country
sure.
after kinetic action. And so when you said you're not ready to give your unqualified support, I was wondering, and you mentioned associated forces. I'm
the
wondering
new country
whether that's
provision is identically troubling.
Okay. Let me ask you, let me go back finally to Russia. So from my own point, let me be clear that until the President publicly declares that Russia interfered in our election and lays out a clear strategy to counter Russian aggression, questions will remain about his commitment to promoting the U.S. national security interests vis-a-vis Russia. Now, you say the administration has taken actions against Russia. But Section 1239A of the FY18 National Defense Authorization Act required the Departments of Defense and State to produce a strategy to counter Russian malign influence. I understand the Department of Defense has finalized its portions of the strategy. but state has yet to complete it. It was due on April 12th of this year. Now, I recognize you haven't been here that long. Will you commit to completing this report, and can you give us a sense of the time frame?
I'll commit to completing the report, and if you'll give me till the beginning of next week, I will get you a date.
I appreciate that.
I'm happy to commit to working diligently on it and not dragging it out. I try to give dates to folks when I know it's in my control. This one's bigger than me.
That's fair enough. Let me just say, I understand the administration has designated under authorities laid out in the Obama-era executive orders some individuals, and we're still speaking about Russia. But in my view, the administration has ignored the will of Congress and the CATSA law by not imposing sanctions under the new mandatory provisions of the law. And to make sure everyone's on the same page, let me run through the mandatory provisions that I believe have been ignored. Section 225, sanctions on special Russian crude oil products. Section 226, sanctions on Russia and other foreign financial institutions. Section 227, sanctions on significant corruption in the Russian Federation. Section 228, sanctions on certain transactions with sanctions evaders and serious human rights abusers. Section 231, sanctions on persons engaged in transactions with the intelligence and defense sectors of the government of the Russian Federation. And 233 and 234, just not to belabor it, sanctions on the transfer of arms and related material to Syria. This is pretty clear. Can you commit to us that you will follow the law? I appreciated what you said earlier in a different context. Follow the law, seek to follow the law every day, and impose sanctions under these mandatory provisions. Let me tell you, as someone who has been the architect of a lot of the sanctions policy, both on Iran and Russia and others, I never saw the Congress actually come to a moment where they made it mandatory without waivers. They did here. And yet, those mandatory provisions are not being followed. Will you commit to pursuing them?
I will. Will you make a commitment that you'll help Secretary Mattis get the waivers that he needs in order to make sure that these sanctions don't hit folks that I think were not intended to be harmed by these sanctions? I know it's not my day to ask questions, but it is my day. It is my day to ask for things that I think
I'm happy to have you ask questions. I don't know how long the chairman would let me get away with that, but in any event, the quick response is that, look, I have to see the specifics of what Secretary Mattis wants, but I also have to say, if we're going to allow countries that are sanctioned because we believe in the sanctions policy, and they want to get off the hook because there's some other benefit, well, then we begin to erode the sanction policies and we pick and choose, and other countries will seek the same question. So I'm open to listen to it, but it has to follow, in essence, what our policy is trying to achieve.
Senator, I appreciate it. I hope I answered your first question with respect to my commitment to those sanctions.
Thank you.